Okay. Okay, welcome everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us here today for our panel, which is entitled Brazil under Bolsonaro, What is Emerging, What is Submerging? My name is Rob Jansen. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Sociology here. I work largely on Peru, on populist politics in the 1930s, but I'm very, very interested to hear what the panelists have to say today. So this event is sponsored by the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies and also co-sponsored by the University of Michigan's Brazil Initiative, as well as the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. We're here today to talk about the regime of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, who built his reputation as a notoriously controversial right-wing politician, as a member of the Brazilian Congress, where he served since 1991, but also more recently, and probably a big part of why we're talking about this here today, since his inauguration this past January as president, his government has faced criticism for its divisive rhetoric, its attacks on the press, its relaxation of environmental standards, cuts to education, among other things, leading many to denounce him as a right-wing authoritarian populist. So to help us wrap our heads around this figure and this complicated political moment, we're fortunate to be joined by three distinguished speakers who will be discussing various aspects of Bolsonaro's government, how that government relates to different stages of Brazilian history, how that government relates to the country's current social and political landscape. So I'm going to go ahead and just do the introductions now so that I can step aside, and we will have, each of the speakers will present, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A after that. So speaking first will be Benjamin Lessing from the University of Chicago, and an assistant professor of political science there. Before joining the University of Chicago, Ben was a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford University Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, as well as its Center on International Security and Cooperation. He earned his PhD and master's degrees in political science at Berkeley, as well as a master's degree in economics at Berkeley. He studies organized violence involving armed groups that do not seek formal state power, so things like drug cartels, prison gangs, paramilitaries. His first book with Cambridge, Making Peace in Drug Wars, examines armed conflict between drug cartels and the state. It's a comparative project of Colombia, Mexico, and Brazil. At the University of Chicago, he directs the Criminal Governance in Latin America project, and also co-directs the program on political violence. My understanding, although I could be wrong, is that he'll be addressing the relationship between the state and organized crime. Speaking second will be Marília Corrêa, if I pronounced that close enough. She is a current postdoctoral fellow here at the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies, recently earned her PhD in history at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and also holds a master's degree from University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign in Latin American and Caribbean Studies. Her recent dissertation is situated at the intersection of political, social, and gender history, as well as the history of memory, law, and human rights in Latin America, and especially the context of the Cold War. The dissertation is entitled Unusual Suspects, Persecuted Officers and Soldiers Under Military Rule in Brazil, 1964 to 1985, and this focused on the military dictatorship in Brazil, examining the life trajectories of armed forces officers and soldiers who didn't support the 1964 coup. And my understanding is that she will be speaking on the Brazilian military dictatorship and the politics of memory in Brazil. You can correct me if I'm wrong. And then finally, we have visiting from Brazil, Guilherme Casarões, who's a lecturer in international relations at the business school of the Fundação Getúlio Vargas in Sao Paulo. Has a PhD and a master's degree in political science from the University of Sao Paulo, as well as a master's degree in international relations from the State University of Campinas. He's authored many articles and book chapters on Brazilian foreign policy and Latin American politics. I'll just note two of them here. The first, most recent, from Latin American Focus, put out by the German Institute of Global and Area Studies, entitled Brazil First, Climate Last, Bolsonaro's Foreign Policy. And then in the recent Routledge Handbook of Brazilian Politics, The Evolution of Brazilian Foreign Policy Studies for perspectives. He's also been a visiting fellow at the University of Tel Aviv, Tel Aviv University and Brandeis University, and we'll be discussing, I think this may be a little bit different, the Brazilian government's international relations and foreign policy. I think you're going to expand in different directions given where you're recently visiting us from. So, but we'll begin with Ben, and without further ado, let's go ahead and welcome him to the stage.
Thanks so much, Robert, and thanks, Dan, also for the invite, and Derek for organizing everything. It's great. I'm from Michigan. I grew up outside of Detroit, so it's great to be, and I studied here Turkish one summer, so it's great to be back at U of M. Victorious. And so I will be speaking today about, hold on, let me just get set up here. There we go. So I also have been in Rio until about maybe a week and a half ago. I spent the summer there, or the winter there, as you will, mostly in Rio de Janeiro, but also in the Northeast, where I have been doing some research as well. And so I'll be talking a little bit about that today. I don't want to go over ground that Robert covered, but I work on organized crime and criminal conflict, in particular armed conflict between criminal groups and the state. My first, I'll mention a couple highlights that I think tie into today's talk. My first book looked at cartel-state conflict, so armed conflict between drug trafficking groups and the state, and it included Rio de Janeiro as a case of that. And so we'll see a little bit of that today. It also introduced logics of why armed criminal groups can engage in violence against the state, including a logic I call violent lobbying, which is kind of the use of terror tactics to force the state to make policy concessions. So we'll see a little bit of that today in today's talk. My second current project is on prison gangs and their ability to control the criminal underworld and even govern slums and urban peripheries out from prison. It focuses heavily on Brazil, which have these facções criminosas, like and so it has sort of Brazil plays a central role, and you'll see quite a bit of that today. And my third project, kind of an ongoing project, looks at this phenomenon of criminal governance, so slums and informal areas, and including prisons themselves being governed by criminal groups. And that has a lot of consequences for public security, issues of crime and violence that have a lot of weight politically, especially in today's Brazil. So all these three themes are going to kind of come up in today's talk. For today, I'm going to focus first a little bit on Rio, and then a little bit on Ceará in the Northeast, and then a little bit at the very end on Sao Paulo and beyond Sao Paulo. And the reason is because in Brazil, public security and crime and violence, which is sort of my wheelhouse, these are things that are really determined at a policy level by governors and not by presidents. And so I'm actually not going to talk that much about Bolsonaro himself today, which is great because you have two incredible presentations to come, I promise you, that are really focusing on Bolsonaro and his particular rhetoric. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the politics around how governors decide what their public security and policing policies are going to be, and really Bolsonaro casts a shadow over all of these governors. The politics that brought Bolsonaro to power cast a shadow. So in Rio, this guy Witzel, who's now the governor, was swept in on the coattails of Bolsonaro. He was Bolsonaro's pick, or Bolsonaro's candidate of Bolsonaro's party. They've now since they're no longer friends, really. And so that's sort of an interesting phenomenon. And in Ceará, the governor, Santana, won re-election as a PT governor, as a member of the Working Party, but he very much moved in a hardline direction as a result of kind of almost outflank the Bolsonaristas and the right wing as well. So you can see these different ways that the politics play out. So let me talk a little bit about Rio. And just to kind of give people a background who maybe don't know, as much about the case or what these, facções really even are, Rio is a place where the very first prison gang in Brazil, the Comando Vermelho, or the very first criminal faction, or whatever we want to call them, was formed during the military dictatorship in the 1970s on Ilha Grande, which housed a very brutal kind of Alcatraz-like prison. And the military dictatorship put left-wing militants together with common criminals in an attempt to depoliticize the political prisoners, but in the process sort of created this, the criminals kind of learned a kind of collective knowledge, collective action, and gleaned a lot of human capital from these leftist militants, and they became a criminal organization that was eventually dubbed the Comando Vermelho, or Red Command, by the state, who mistakenly thought that they were communists. They weren't really communists, but whatever they were effective, and they very quickly took over Rio's drug trade and favelas, and very kind of quickly transformed the urban periphery. They took over, sort of dominated the underworld, and took over these peripheral communities, and then really from the 80s on engaged in a violent militarized conflict with Rio's police, kind of constant confrontational stance, and then they also split into multiple factions, which is where we get this name, facções criminosas, and a war among these sort of cartels or factions has ensued ever since. And so this time series here are police killings of civilians, right? Civilians killed by police in supposedly confrontations, right? The official category used to be self-defense on the part of police. Now it's just called homicides as a result of police action. And you can see sort of a upward trend in the early 90s, then it kind of levels off, goes down a bit, then another upward trend, then it kind of levels off. And there's been this sort of pendulum effect as politicians have come in and become more hardline, and we're going to send in the police, and they're going to kill all the bandits, and they're going to reestablish the power of the state. And they usually do kill a lot of bandits or kill a lot of people, not all of them bandits. But in the end, it doesn't really resolve the situation. Sometimes leftist governments have come in and you've seen some downticks, and so on and so forth. That's been the history of Rio de Janeiro over the last 30 years. There was this big dip here in the 2000s, from 2008 to 2012, when the pacification UPP project came into play, and this is something I talk a lot about in my book, that really reduced violence dramatically. But that sort of eroded for a host of reasons, which don't have time to talk about today. But by 2016, 2017, we were sort of back to where we started. So if you look at 2018, you can see it's almost, I'm going to use this laser pointer. You can see almost, the trend from the early 2000s, if you carried it out, and this pacification experience was in a sense a kind of an exception to the rule. This is all preface to say that in 2018, Wilson Witzel, who is Bolsonaro's candidate for governor, campaigns on a platform of I'm going to kill more bandidos. I'm going to give cops the freedom to do what they need to do. They're going to be free to shoot bandidos in their head. When they see the bandito holding a machine gun, they can just shoot him in the head. They don't need to worry about, their rights or due process. This is the kind of language he used. He posed from police helicopters as a kind of a guy who would let the police, he would unchain the police to do the work they needed to do. This is at a time in a year when police had already killed a record number of people in 2018. So he's elected on a platform of more police violence in 2018, which was already a banner year. And unsurprisingly, we're now on track for an even higher number of deaths in 2019. Right now, we're at 1,059 civilians killed by police this year so far. And so if you project that out, it should be in the realm of between 1,800 and 2,000 civilians killed by police in 2019. I just want to emphasize that in sort of Civil War studies, we often think of a baseline level of what is a civil war is a conflict that kills 1,000 people or more per year. So just taking the number of civilians killed by police in Rio would put us well beyond that criterion for what a civil war is. It's more than twice as many people are killed in the entire United States in a year by police. So this is a very extreme level of police violence. And in some ways, I think that the sort of clown show, if you will, of the Bolsonaro presidency with the speeches and all of that stuff has in some ways distracted international attention from what's going on in Rio, because it's very much a kind of killing field situation. This is Governor Witzel, and so, this is just some things that have happened over the summer, right? So August, there was a hostage crisis, and this guy took this bus hostage on the bridge from Niterói to to Rio, and Witzel got a chance to use his policy, his signature policy of having snipers. And so a police sniper got on top of a fire truck and shot the hostage taker dead, and none of the hostages were hurt. And that was in part because the hostage taker didn't have a real gun. He was using a fake gun, and so he couldn't actually hurt any of the hostages. But in any case, this was Witzel's big moment. You can see here he's very happy, sort of jumping for joy that his sniper thing worked out. At this moment, it really looked like, and I should mention the bigger context here is that although police homicides are up in Rio, overall homicides are down. And so Witzel's claiming that his, letting the police run rampant has basically brought about a reduction in homicide statewide, right? And so this was sort of a victory moment for him, and it looked like, wow, this is, maybe he was right all along or whatever. This policy was going to sort of go through the roof. But in the last, and there's been a lot of pushback, right? And so these kind of videos keep surfacing. Let me see if I can. These kind of videos are circulating where people are filming police activity and showing really how brutal it is towards civilians in slum areas.
Nada a ver, tá andando um senhor. Ele continua totalmente descontrolado. Tem morador passando na calçada, ele vai apontar a arma para ele. Ele de costas podia ter tomado um tiro, nem viu. O policial continua descontrolado, porque na construção do inimigo tudo periférico.
The narrator's talking about how in peripheral areas, residents are construed as an enemy, right? Poor, often black residents are themselves suspect, and they're treated as such by this kind of militarized policing that's going on. They're treated as suspects, and they're treated as enemies first, and then innocents later. So one of the problems with this is that so this is terrorizing the kind of the slum population, and there's finally started to be some pushback. Another thing that triggered some pushback was a scene that happened in Mare just about a week or two ago, where a police helicopter was conducting a raid, and they ended up machine gun fire got sprayed into a school, and so about 20 or so bullets, I think, were found within this school. And there was a lot of footage of the students and the teachers out in the hall. So this is sort of like an active shooter drill, except that the active shooter is the state, right? And so this drew a lot of attention and a lot of pushback as well. And on the very same day, you may have seen this girl, Agatha Felix, 8 years old, was shot in the back by police during a police raid. And this also triggered a lot of attention. She's only one of 5 or 6 children under 10 to die this year in Rio. She's one of, as I said, over 1,000 civilians to be killed by police, but sort of the innocence of her, it drew the attention of a lot of people and triggered a lot of protests. So in part because of this pushback, the one good piece of news I have for you is that, and this does relate back to Bolsonaro, at the federal level, Congress has stripped out of Sergio Moro's crime bill. Sergio Moro is the Minister of Justice. He has this very sort of hardcore anti-crime bill that's supposed to even further allow police latitude to use lethal force. The Congress just stripped out of it this provision that widened the legal scope of legitimate self-defense to include things like being afraid, surprised, or just emotional. And so this was sort of a kind of a carte blanche that they wanted to write into federal law to protect police from persecution in the case of killing civilians, that as a result of these most recent sort of scandals has gotten stripped out. And another piece of good news from my perspective is that there's been some good social science policy, sort of policy-directed social science happening, where there's some research teams. There's a research team at the Ministério Público. The Ministério Público is kind of like sort of DA, public prosecutor's office, but they have a lot of autonomy. And so the research wing there has been doing a lot of research and pushing back on this notion that it's the increase in police lethality that's driving the reduction in homicide. So this is just a basic correlational exercise they did, where they showed that the places with the reduction in homicide in Rio are not the places where the police are killing more. And the places with the reduction in other crimes, crimes against property crimes, are also not the places where the police are killing more. The police are killing more, guess where? In poor, peripheral neighborhoods, and that's not where the reductions in crime are happening. And so, this kind of, it's just heartening to see actual social scientists having at least some impact on the public debate. Okay, let me talk a little bit about Ceará. This is up in the northeast of Brazil. And this is an interesting place from the perspective of my research. Rio has had these same factions for 30 years. Sao Paulo, I'll talk about in a minute, has had the same faction since the 90s. But the rest of Brazil is experiencing a process of factionalization, where these prison-based drug trafficking organizations are moving in and transforming the local scenario from a bunch of little tiny street gangs into a situation where you have 2 or 3 large gangs per city. And Ceará is really at the forefront of that. Ceará is a place where maybe even 3 or 4 years ago in the 2013, 2014 was suffering a homicide wave due to a war among myriad gangs, tiny little street gangs fighting amongst each other, and a spiral of violence. Then in late 2015, 2016, these gangs were unified by the Comando Vermelho, the PCC from Sao Paulo, another big prison gang, and a local gang called GDE. Guardiões do Estado, or the Guardians of the State. These gangs subsumed all of the little street gangs into 3 large prison gangs, and then they declared a peace amongst themselves. They declared a truce. This was declared through, graffiti, as well as a passeato do crime, where they got all the gang members and literally from prison told all these street gang members, you have to go march with your former enemies, which they did. Much to the surprise of even themselves, even their own gang members couldn't believe this, but they found a way to do it. For residents, for residents of slum areas, this was a huge advance, because whereas previously their communities were divided into very small little, block by block, and you couldn't always go to even your own family member's house because you might have to cross some invisible boundary, once the prison gangs took over the entire neighborhood and subsumed all those little street gangs, the entire neighborhood became passable. And so for residents, this was a huge boon. Unfortunately, this truce broke down in late 2016 and 2017 when the PCC and the Comando Vermelho at the national level, they had a kind of a non-aggression pact that broke down. And so we started to see resurgence of gang war, but now at a much higher level. Now a gang war between 3 kind of mega gangs that controlled the entire city. And we saw a lot of these terror attacks, bus burnings, and attacks on public buildings, often accompanied by what they call salves, or letters from the gangs that made specific policy demands. And this is where that idea of the violent lobbying is helpful to understand the dynamics in Ceará. These gangs were demanding that the government make actual changes to formal state policy, in this case, prison policy. They were demanding that each gang be given its own prison unit or entire prison or prison wing and be segregated from other gangs for the safety of their own members, and threatening to continue the terroristic violence if they didn't get their policy demands met. So this led to another spike in violence in Ceará. In 2017 and 2018 saw even more violence than previous years as this gang war exploded. Governor Santana of the PT had a policy of simply denying the existence of these gangs, although eventually he was kind of forced to admit them. Then in 2018, towards the end of 2018, I'm going to get ahead of myself, Santana had a kind of, he's a PT governor. He had tried to have a somewhat more humanistic policy towards policing. He had this Ceará Pacifica policy. He faced a right-wing threat from a hardline guy who was himself a police officer. And so he moved hard to the right to win re-election in 2018. And he appointed a security secretary and a public security secretary and a prison secretary who were both themselves police officers and both hardliners. And particularly this prison secretary triggered not only, he announced he was going to desegregate the prisons. He was going to put all the gangs together. And this triggered the gangs forming another truce and turning together to attack the state. So the year began in Ceará with 2 months of the most severe wave of bus burning attacks that the country has seen since 2006. It was over 300 attacks over the course of 2 months. So buses blown, bombs going off all over the state. And all aimed at getting this guy, Mauro Albuquerque, out of office, right? Explicit demands being made to get this guy out of office. This guy's I've interviewed him a couple of times. I mean, he really is an intense figure, right? So he sits in his gabinete, in his office, dressed like that, with a bulletproof vest and a Bowie knife, and a grenade strapped to him, because he says that's his suit, right? That's his business suit. And he believes, he's a hardliner. He believes in hardcore repression within the prison system will break the back of the factions, right? Of the gangs. And the gangs are fighting back, right? So here you see this salvi where they've signed it now, not the name of one gang, but just organized crime as a whole, and demanding the resignation of this governor. So these are all ways in which the governor obviously hasn't gotten rid of his secretary, but at the same time, I would say that they have not. They also haven't mixed the prisoners, right? They say they're going to mix the prisoners, but they haven't mixed the prisoners. Okay. And one interesting thing to note: this top line here is homicides in the state. You can see that when this gang truce happened and the attacks began at the beginning of the year, the actual homicide rate plummeted because the gangs had formed a truce amongst themselves. But the number of attacks, the city was being shut down, buses were pulled off the street, but the homicide rate was actually quite low. And so there's this real paradox where gangs are able to bring down the homicide rate when they're at peace with one another, and these attacks just began. A new wave of attacks just began again literally a week ago, and are still going on right now. So stay tuned on that story. Let me just a final sort of throwaway sort of comparison here. I won't have time to go into great detail. It's just Sao Paulo, where there's no truce among gangs because there's only one gang. There's just the PCC. The PCC took over in the 90s, dominated the prison system of Sao Paulo. In 2006, it launched this mega wave of attacks, which even today still inspires other gangs, as we see from Ceará. This was the mother of all of these attacks. Lasted 4 days, shut Sao Paulo down. But ever since, the PCC has exerted control over the urban periphery, and most particularly has imposed what they call law of crime, where you're prohibited from committing murder without the PCC's permission. So if you want to kill somebody in the slums of Sao Paulo, you have a trial before a jury of imprisoned PCC members via cell phone to decide whether you're allowed to commit the crime, whether you're allowed to kill the person or not. And as a result, this has contributed to a massive reduction in homicide in Sao Paulo. And just to give you some idea, Sao Paulo is now the state with the lowest homicide rate. It's the capital city with the lowest homicide rate. It has been so for several years now. And you can see in this period 2006 and 2007, while the rest of Brazil homicide rate was increasing, Sao Paulo's was decreasing so fast that it bent the whole curve for Brazil downward, and that this remains a very stable and very low homicide rate. We don't know what part of that is due. We can't put a number on that. What part of that is due to the fact that there's just this one hegemonic prison gang? But it seems completely obvious to me that that's a key contributor to the fact that Sao Paulo has now become a very safe city with a homicide rate lower than Chicago. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to the other talks. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And next up we have Marília Corrêa.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank you for being here, and thank you. I'll thank as well the Weiser Center for inviting me to be in this panel, and I'll get right to it. Find myself. Yeah. All right. So, in 2016, Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff was impeached and removed from office. She was charged with criminal administrative misconduct and disregard for the federal budget in violation of the fiscal responsibility law. While 367 members of Congress voted favorably, only 137 voted against impeachment. Anyone who followed the news on that day remembers how Brazilian Congress looked like, and if you don't, there's a picture. All right, so during the process, congressmen and women had to go forward and manifest their vote publicly. But they would give speeches before doing so, some dedicating their votes to their own families, others to God, and others to the Brazilian people. Jair Bolsonaro, who was, as we've been talking about here, an army captain who decided to join the Army Reserves and run for public office in 1988, was still a congressman in 2016 and voted to impeach the president with the following speech. And it's there. So he said, they lost in 1964, they lost again in 2016. Against communism, for our freedom, for the memory of Coronel Carlos Alberto Brilhante Ustra, Dilma Rousseff's horror, for our armed forces, for a Brazil above all, and for a God above everyone, my vote is yes. So when Bolsonaro pays his tribute to Ustra and to the dictatorship, in this moment, he speaks to a certain memory that lingered on in Brazil about the military dictatorship. And today I want to speak about that, about the national memory or memories in the plural that were created in Brazil during that era and after 1985. So in my own research, I examine persecution within the armed forces in Brazil between 1964 and 1985. And I focus on the specific cases of officers and soldiers who were seen as communists and subversives and who were expelled, imprisoned, and harassed by the regime during the era. And although my research is not necessarily or in an obvious way connected to the subject we're dealing here today, there are several points of connection between this history and the discourses Jair Bolsonaro has been relying on to legitimate his numerous statements and opinions about Brazilian society and about his the opposition, right? And in order to get to these connections, I have organized this talk in this following way. I'll start talking about the era of the dictatorship itself, and then move to talk about memory, so the politics of memory in Brazil during the dictatorship and after 85, and then transition to Bolsonaro's memory on the dictatorship. I want to start also with about this part on the era of the dictatorship with a brief history of the involvement of the military in politics. So in Brazil, the armed forces have held an important position in the country's political landscape since the beginning of the First Republic in 1889. During the 1920s, clear political divisions between military officers started to form, and two main currents, one legalist and another revolutionary, were created. And since this moment, it was possible to identify an interventionist faction inside the military, which was this revolutionary one, who did not just want to protect the country against external threats, but who also believed officers had the responsibility to intervene in politics in times of crisis. And these divisions only deepened in the following decades. An anti-communist sentiment gained strength among servicemen during the Cold War. So during the 1950s and until 1964, an anti-communist repertoire that had long existed inside the armed forces was reordered and used to explain and rationalize a military coup. Anti-communist officers attempted to intervene in politics several times during the 1950s and 60s as they were opposing the governments of Getúlio Vargas, Juscelino Kubitschek, and João Goulart. But only in 1964, they had enough support inside and outside the armed forces to finally overthrow President Goulart. And interviews with those who led these revolts indicate how the context of the Cold War, which saw the world in binaries, influenced officers who were in the forefront of a movement that resisted change in Brazil and saw any progressive policy as communist. João Paulo Moreira Brunier, who became, he's right there, who became an important intelligence officer during the dictatorship, believed that what he called the revolution, what I like to call a coup, of 1964, was the anti-communist officers' last attempt to prevent Brazil from falling in the hands of Bolsheviks. And as I will continue to show, the same discourse grounded on a Cold War anti-communism and the belief of the communist infiltration in Brazil was brought back in recent years and gained strength with Bolsonaro, who believed that communists were out to take Brazil in 1964, and they were out to take Brazil again in the 2000s. Okay, so in 1964, with the support of the elites and sectors of the middle class, anti-communist officers finally overthrew President Goulart and institutionalized the military coup that lasted 21 years in Brazil, right? Here are a couple of pictures from the era. Here is military tanks in the street on April 1st, 1964. And here we have a few days before the coup, it was a march that was asking for military intervention. And in this sign, it says, Brazil will not be a new Cuba, right? So there was this monster, this ghost of the communism. All right, so after taking power, the coup leaders worked to eliminate any oppositions they faced in any sectors of Brazilian society. So in the armed forces, which is my area of expertise in particular, to rid the military of opposition, they imprisoned and expelled thousands of officers and soldiers. And in doing so, these military leaders aimed to unite the institution, eliminating communists, but mostly the nationalist faction of officers who offered dissent, which I just talked about, right? And in that purpose, they were relatively successful. So in 2014, the Brazilian National Truth Commission, created to investigate human rights violations in Brazil, showed that about 6,500 members of the military were expelled from the institution for political reasons. And this shows that the armed forces were proportionally the group that faced greatest political persecution during the era, so during the dictatorship. Here we have a picture of Admiral Cândido Aragão and sailors. So Cândido Aragão was Goulart's supporter, and these sailors are members of the sailors movement who were fighting for their rights right before the coup, and all of them were expelled from the armed forces. So in my own research, I study multiple cases, right, of officers and soldiers who were persecuted during the era. But here I just wanted to bring a couple of examples to show you, kind of give you a picture of what were some of the things that were happening to these men. Brigadier Rui Moreira Lima, for example, had received several medals of honor for participating in 94 missions in World War II. And he was expelled from the Air Force for subversion. One day after the coup, he was ordered to leave the command of Santa Cruz Air Base for opposing the coup. In addition to being in prison and expelled, military pilots like him had their flying license revoked, which kind of limited the possibilities of what they could do after they were expelled from the military, right? The careers they could seek afterwards. Manuel Raimundo Soares offers a different example. He was a sergeant, and he had participated in a movement of sergeants that also fought for the rights of sergeants before '64. And right in '64, he started living clandestinely because he knew the dictatorship was seeking for him. So 2 years after the coup, in March '66, the political police captured him. And after about 4 months in prison, his body was found by the coast of a river in Rio Grande do Sul. Both his hands and his feet were tied. The state conducted an investigation, and an autopsy showed that he had been murdered by drowning while in prison. So it was a torture method. He died in the middle of the process, and the police lost his body in the river. Although the dictatorship was relatively more violent to those who joined resistance movements, which was the case of Soares, it harassed and imprisoned those who stayed out of political structured organizations just as much. So the idea that the Brazilian dictatorship only persecuted those who were connected to guerrilla groups is a myth. For the men who served the armed forces, this is even more accurate than for civilians, as they were subjected to a hierarchical structure that allowed superior officers to question them constantly. Many were subjected to violations such as physical and psychological torture inside the barracks they worked. Instead of imprisoning them using the system of the political police, many soldiers were imprisoned inside their own units and harassed by their superior officers and colleagues. So the history of political persecution inside the armed forces show us that in the name of protecting the country against the communist threat, coup leaders sought to eliminate opposition inside the military and create a narrative that presented the armed forces as a united body that was 100% supportive of intervention. However, this official version of the events, which relied on this myth of the communist threat, was challenged already during this era and lost strength immediately after redemocratization. And now, transitioning. So after the dictatorship officially ended in 1985, different social groups and institutions started to reflect and consider what Brazilians had just experienced during this period. In these discussions, it became clear that different groups remembered the last 21 years very differently. During the dictatorship, and due to censorship, most of the population received little information about police persecution. So aside from the groups that were directly persecuted, most Brazilians would only receive official communications about what was happening, what the dictatorship allowed the population to know. And as the regime released decrees that imposed censorship or criminalized opposition, they would say that those who did not like it should leave. So, sorry, that's the slide I wanted. And this slogan, so Brazil, love it or leave it. Then after 1985, both the state and civilians started to form commissions and projects to investigate the violations of the dictatorship, such as this group, Brasil Nunca Mais, or Brazil Never Again. And with these new institutions, new information came to light. These groups started to push for a reevaluation of the official version or official memory of history generals in power had constructed from 64 to 85. However, different experiences with the regime created a political conflict in terms of how different institutions wanted the era to be remembered. So the national memory about the dictatorship was constructed in two different memories. In the first moment, still during the era when fragmented experiences with the dictatorship, which were mediated by the officers in power, shaped national memory. Opponents still challenged official narratives during the era, yet the dictatorship imposed an official version about what was happening, and those who challenged this version were harassed, tortured, sometimes killed. And then in the second moment, which came after 1985, the mechanisms and institutions of transitional justice challenged the official narrative the military government had constructed, and the groups who had been violently silenced proposed new questions and a new framework to remember the dictatorship. In both of these moments, there was a battle for how Brazil must deal with the politics of remembering military rule. And although social groups throughout Brazil remember the dictatorship in the most distinct ways, from 85 up until very recently, two main memory poles fought for their own projects in a national scale, right? So one that advocated for forgiving as a way to move forward, and this means that the forgiving of all crimes and all sides, and the other one that believed that the only way to move forward was actually remembering and addressing non-resolved issues so they would never be repeated in history. So from 1985 to about the 2010s, I don't want to put a date into that because Bolsonaro had been talking about this since the 1990s. The official version of events had lost space in the public debate. And then we saw a narrative in favor of the dictatorship return to the public debate, which is Bolsonaro's narrative on the era about the dictatorship. So throughout his entire life in the public office, he praised military rule using the same discourses of the officers who led the coup. So in an interview in 1999, he claimed that that during the dictatorship, people were better taken care of. He's also spoken in favor of the killing of communists. So he said, I'm in favor of torture. People had dignity during the military regime era. And he defends a civil war, that a civil war would do the work that the military regime did not, killing about 30,000 people. And then in this interview, he also defends the killing of the president at the time, Fernando Henrique Cardoso. He has also reproduced the same narrative of coup leaders such as Bournier, which we talked about a few slides back, claiming the military took power because Brazil was going to be turned into a communist nation. He did not deny people were in prison, tortured, killed, but he claimed these acts were justifiable because the people this happened with were members of the guerrilla movement, were terrorists, and so on. I don't know if it was because of it or in spite of it, but Bolsonaro was elected. He gained space in the public debates. He gained national relevance, and he became president with this discourse, with this narrative. Okay. But while he was giving these interviews and claiming the dictatorship was necessary, okay, there was something else happening in Brazil, right? And Dilma Rousseff, who was elected in 2010, she created the National Truth Commission, who started to investigate these violations. And she was the first president since 1985 to organize a more systematic effort to investigate these violations. Rousseff herself had been a member of the guerrilla movement, and she was captured and imprisoned for 2 years in 1970. So the Truth Commission started to investigate these crimes and the dictatorship itself. So when Bolsonaro paid tribute to the dictatorship and to Coronel Carlos Brilhante Ustra during Rousseff's impeachment vote, he was positioning himself against the work of the Truth Commission and against a specific memory about the period. In 2006, Ustra published this book, The Suffocated Truth, right, claiming that exactly that the repression was necessary to stop communists in Brazil. And Bolsonaro shared Ustra's memory on the era and the idea that the violations of the regime were necessary and successful in stopping the communist threat. Bolsonaro positioned himself against Rousseff's government to push to investigate the dictatorship during the impeachment process. And his speech also served as a message, right? We stopped communism then, and we'll stop communism now. So his numerous statements as an apologist of the dictatorship served as an indicator for what would come during his campaign for presidency and his government. He was elected president in 2018 with the promise of eliminating the red ones, as they call them, which were members of the Workers' Party, Rousseff's party, which he considered to be communists. And the same discourse of eliminating opposition, which was characteristic of the military coup, is a mark of Bolsonaro's speeches. During the 9 months in power, he continued to rely on the idea of the communist enemy, taking advantage of the political polarization in Brazil and claiming that if the people fail to support him, the communists will come back. And I'll finish with this. So here's a fragment of his speech at the UN. I won't read it, so we can finish early. But so after 1985, the discussion became whether the dictatorship should be investigated or left in the past, right? During the 1910s, however, when the project of remembering and investigating it started gaining track, another, which was more reactionary than the one that defended amnesty for all sides, gained strength. Bolsonaro's ascension to power indicates that the battle for memory about the era of military rule is still at play in Brazil and continues to impact Brazilian politics. Therefore, the historical debate remains essential to imagine new futures for democratic rule in Brazil. Thank you.
Then our third speaker is Guilherme Casarões.
Thank you very much for your presence. I'm very happy to be here. I would like to thank the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies for inviting me over to talk about Bolsonaro's Brazil. I've just arrived from the eye of the hurricane, so I have a lot to talk about. And I hope that in 20 minutes I can do the trick here. I want to speak about two things, two aspects of Bolsonaro's government. The first one is Brazil's new identity. Ever since Bolsonaro got elected back in October last year, he's trying to convince Brazilians that, and the world, obviously, that Brazil has become a whole new country. So Brazil's new identity is one of the most pungent and most important elements of Bolsonaro's narrative ever since he got to office. And the second aspect I want to talk about is how it impacts foreign policy. So foreign policy has become one of the most important battlegrounds of Brazil's new narrative, or narratives in the plural. So I'm going to talk about how this new identity has had an outcome, a very important effect on foreign policy decisions and foreign policy strategies. So the title of my presentation is Jair Bolsonaro and the Reshaping of Brazil's National Identity. I personally like this picture because it's from a couple of months ago in the March for Jesus, and Bolsonaro was one of the most important, if not the most important, guest of the March for Jesus, and he's here pointing. He does this finger gun thing all the time. What's curious about this specific picture is that whenever you are marching for Jesus, you're not supposed to preach violence of any kind, and that's precisely what he's been doing. Now, one of the most important aspects of Bolsonaro's administration is that they have consistently talked about Bolsonaro as an anti-system or anti-establishment candidate who basically broke the system. So the idea of breaking the system is very common among populists of all kinds, both left and right, and it has become a staple of right-wing populists across the world. So if you look at Duterte in the Philippines, or if you look at Erdogan in Turkey, or if you look at Trump in the United States, all of them somehow bring over this idea of breaking with the system so as to inaugurate a whole new era of democracy and popular will. I personally like this text. This piece was published in January 2019 by current Foreign Minister Ernesto Araújo. The title is very suggestive. Now We Do. It's basically about the new era of Brazil in which people can freely talk about God. And he does, he brings a lot of information and new insights on what the new Brazil would look like. And one of the most important things is that he basically says that dominance was established, dominance by the old system was established over the political institutions, over the economy, and over the culture. And he calls Brazil up until 2018 a thoroughly totalitarian enterprise. So basically breaking with the system would mean to break with the left and the totalitarian enterprise that we have witnessed ever since redemocratization back in the 1980s. And one of the best moments of this piece is when he says that there were three elements responsible for breaking the system, breaking with the past. The first one is Olavo de Carvalho, who's a prominent writer in Brazil. I mean, nobody had actually heard about him up until 2013, 2014. But now he's become one of the most, if not the most popular public intellectuals in Brazil. And he presents himself as a philosopher. And then Araújo also mentions Operation Car Wash, which was a graft probe that started in 2013 and continues up until this day, was basically an anti-corruption investigation or set of investigations. And finally, Jair Bolsonaro. So Bolsonaro was on the political realm, the figure who helped break the system, as put by Araújo, our current foreign minister. And Araújo, by the way, he keeps a blog that he launched in October last year. So prior to the first round of elections, he launched this blog. It's called Metapolitics 17. 17 was the number, was Bolsonaro's number in the ballot, right? So it's a very suggestive title. Metapolitics or Metapolitica 17, and the subtitle here is Against Globalism. So he basically launched this blog a year ago saying that he was campaigning not necessarily for Bolsonaro but against globalism. I'm pretty sure that you've all heard the expression globalism before. It has become very commonplace in American politics too. And the meaning is pretty much the same. The idea that there are forces that sometimes we cannot see, that impose a set of ideas, a set of values, or a set of behavioral directives to people, basically running counter to people's culture. So the idea of globalism would be this totalitarian enterprise of undertaken by Marxist politicians or Marxist professors all across the country. And this has become the most important element of Bolsonaro's narrative, as I'm going to show you in a minute. So basically, the idea of fighting globalism is a very important element of Bolsonaro's narrative, as vindicated by Foreign Minister Araújo. And let me just underline the element of metapolitics here. The idea of metapolitics has become a very important a key element of Bolsonaro's narrative, because before setting up political strategies, the idea of Bolsonaro is to reshape the country's identity. So before politics comes metapolitics, in the sense that there's something that we must change before proceeding to the political debate proper. And metapolitics is also a very important expression used by the alt-right, not only in Brazil, but also in the United States and elsewhere. If you look at prominent thinkers of the alt-right across the world, you're going to see that metapolitics is a very important element of this. And it's defined as a strategy to disseminate and anchor a particular set of cultural ideas, attitudes, and values in a society, as opposed to the prevailing left-wing narratives, in order to lay the groundwork for deeper political change. That's a definition made by Daniel Freiberg, who's one of the most prominent Swedish alt-right intellectuals. And one of the most important elements of metapolitics is that metapolitics involves, especially from the perspective of the alt-right, a distinction between who's friend and who's enemy in this new setting. So it follows Carl Schmitt's seminal work, which is the concept of the political, that was published in the 1920s. So basically, metapolitics here would enable the emerging political elite, as well as the masses, to redefine through new cultural standards friends and enemies of the nation. So if you pay close attention to what Bolsonaro has been saying ever since he got elected, he basically tries all the time to distinguish who's friends and who's enemies of the nation. It's never my friend or my enemy. It's enemy of Brazil and friend of Brazil. And Bolsonaro, as a politician, he represents the translation of the metapolitical warfare into actual political power, which means the forging of a whole new liberal-conservative alliance. So this is also something that Bolsonaro has insisted very often in his narrative, the idea that he represents not only a break with the left, but also the forging of an alliance between economic liberals and social conservatives, pretty much as in the United States and elsewhere. Now, Bolsonaro's social platform is pretty diverse. So if we ask the question, who are Brazil's friends, especially after Bolsonaro got elected, we basically have four large social groups supporting Bolsonaro's politics. The first one, represented by Economy Minister Paulo Guedes, is the free market liberals. And there's a distinction here between Brazil and the U.S. because in the United States, Trump is at the same time a globalist, an anti-globalist, and in some ways an anti-liberal, in the sense that he's trying to protect America's industries and so on and so forth. In the case of Brazil, we see free market liberals as one of the driving forces of Bolsonaro's administration. And then we have, represented by Justice Minister Sergio Moro, the anti-corruption activists. They also have become a very important element of Brazil's political transformation in the last 5 years or so, with the 2013 demonstrations and after. And then we have, on the other side, the religious conservatives, mainly represented by evangelical Christians and neo-Pentecostal Christians, to be more specific, even though we see some elements of the Catholic faith in between the evangelical narrative. And finally, we have the military patriots. Marília has spoken about the how some of Bolsonaro's supporters miss the times of the dictatorship, and these people, they have formed an alliance around the armed forces and the military, and Bolsonaro has brought a number of military officials onto the government, and this is also a very important thing. Now, the slogan of Bolsonaro's campaign, the one that he said when he voted for President Rousseff's impeachment back in 2016, and he kept repeating it ever since, is the idea of Brazil above everything and God above everyone. So this notion of patriotic and religious sentiments blending together is one of the most pungent elements of Bolsonaro's narrative. Now, who are Brazil's enemies according to Bolsonaro? So we basically have Lula, our former Brazilian President Lula, as the embodiment of Brazil's enemies. So every time anyone criticizes Bolsonaro, there will be a Bolsonaro supporter asking, what about Lula? Because Lula is probably the most corrupt person in the world, and so on and so forth. So Lula has become the face of Bolsonaro's struggle. But we can also think about three other enemies of the nation, thinking about the domestic side of it. The first one is the political establishment. Secondly, we have the social justice warriors. One of the most repeated struggles of the new administration is against the politically correctness of social justice warriors. And finally, the traditional social gatekeepers, especially the mass media, such as Globo or Folha de São Paulo or Estado de São Paulo, and universities as well. Now, this is all very intuitive, because if you look at how Bolsonaro has been trying to build his narrative, you're going to find all these elements of friends and enemies put together. But there is an element of consistency to this narrative, which is very important to underline. Sometimes we have to move beyond intuition and imagine whether there's somebody pulling the strings or trying to concretely build a narrative of friends and enemies in the Bolsonaro administration. He also keeps saying it's a passage from the Gospel of John 8:32, which is, and ye shall know the truth, and truth shall make you free. This is something that Bolsonaro keeps repeating ever since he got to office, ever since he made his first speech when he won the elections in October last year. And he basically affirms that there's a truth that nobody's able to see, a truth that has nothing to do with the facts, but it has to do with how people feel the truth. And And the truth is nothing more than a whole new narrative about the country that he tries to bring over. Now, the person who can be considered the mastermind behind this new idea of who's Brazil's friends and who are Brazil's enemies is this philosopher, as I told you, Olavo de Carvalho, who's a very prominent writer. He's been writing about Brazilian politics ever since the 1990s. He was an astrologist back in the 1980s, so he moved from astrology to Islam to political philosophy, and now he became a public intellectual on his own, and he can be considered the mastermind of Bolsonaro's narrative. So if there's any consistency in what Bolsonaro says, it's mostly thanks to Olavo de Carvalho's work. Back in the demonstrations of 2013 and 14, you could find a lot of people carrying signs with the following saying, Olavo is right, or Olavo tem razão, Olavo is always right, or something along these lines. But up until 2013, I'd say that his appeal was very specific to some niches. He didn't speak to Brazilians in general. After 2013, after people started to say that he was right, he started to draw people's attention, and he launched 2 books. One of these books, The Collective Imbecile, is a book originally published in 1996, but he was re-edited in 2014. And then there's another book which became a bestseller in 2014 and 15, The Minimum You Need to Know Not to Be an Idiot. So these 2 books have become, let's say, the bulk of Bolsonaro's narrative as he became the president of Brazil. But the most important feature of Bolsonaro's narrative and of Carvalho's role in shaping Bolsonaro's narrative is the fact that he was able to appoint a number of different people to Bolsonaro's administration, to his cabinet most specifically. So it called people's attention back when the government was being formed that Olavo de Carvalho was able to appoint at least 3 ministers out of 24 ministers in Bolsonaro's cabinet, even though Olavo de Carvalho had no vote at all. He was able to appoint, first of all, Abraham Weintraub, who's the Minister of Education. He's actually the second Minister of Education because we had another one who had also been appointed by Olavo de Carvalho up until March this year. Damares Alves, who's the Minister of Human Rights, and Ernesto Araújo, who's the Minister of Foreign Affairs. So they were all appointed by Olavo de Carvalho himself, and that became a very important feature of Bolsonaro's administration. Especially the more ideological ministries have become part of this narrative of Olavo de Carvalho. And then we have 3 former students of Olavo de Carvalho. He also teaches online courses. And 2 of them are Bolsonaro's sons. So Carlos Bolsonaro and Eduardo Bolsonaro, who's now the chairman of the House Foreign Relations Committee, they are former Olavo de Carvalho students. And the advisor for international affairs of the Bolsonaro administration, Felipe Martins, he's also a former Olavo de Carvalho student and probably the most prominent of his students. And he's only 31, and he's the equivalent to the United States National Security Advisor. He is probably one of the most powerful men in Brasilia today. And we have a number of Congress people who also support Olavo de Carvalho's ideas in Congress, both in the House and in the Senate. So all these things, they form this very interesting landscape of a whole new ideology or a whole new identity for Brazil. Olavo de Carvalho, he has a counterpart in the United States, Steve Bannon. You've probably heard about him before. Bannon is one of the foreign intellectuals. I'm not sure if I can call him an intellectual, but he's one of the foreign leaders who's more often visited by Bolsonaro and his close aides. So he was at a dinner when Bolsonaro came to the United States in March. He was at a dinner with Olavo de Carvalho and Bolsonaro himself. Bannon was consulted even for Bolsonaro's speech at the United Nations. So there is many newspapers reveal that Bannon was he had a meeting with Foreign Minister Araújo and Eduardo Bolsonaro and Felipe Martins before Bolsonaro's speech at the United Nations. Now, just to conclude, what are the foreign policy implications of this new identity of Brazil, or of this new Brazil? I personally like this picture because all the foreign policy decision makers are in the same picture. Here you see Felipe Martins, the advisor, Olavo de Carvalho, the prophet, or the Ayatollah of Brazilian government, Bolsonaro, Araújo, and Bolsonaro's son, who's probably going to become the next Brazilian ambassador in Washington, D.C. So this is also very powerful. The implications is that Brazil will have new partners, both new partners and new enemies abroad. So one of the most visible aspects of Bolsonaro's foreign policy based on his new identity is that he became friends with very specific leaders across the world. So Donald Trump, Hungary's Viktor Orban, Italy's Matteo Salvini, Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu, and Argentina's Mauricio Macri. And these are pretty much the only partners of this new Brazil because of ideological proximity, basically. And if you think, this is something that Araújo said, we admire those who fight for their country and who love themselves as a people. Now, because of this new set of partners that Brazil has, we also have new enemies. And this contradicts pretty much the tradition, the historical tradition of Brazil's foreign policy. So nowadays, we have basically two big sets of enemies that might be translated into the ideas of globalism and socialism. We have a George Soros as the representative of this globalist conspiracy that Brazil is allegedly fighting against, and Fidel Castro as the representative of Brazil's fight against socialism. And then the United Nations, Emmanuel Macron of France, and the European Union members as a whole, NGOs at large, are considered the new globalist enemies of Brazil. And on the other hand, you have the Forum of Sao Paulo, which is a congregation of left-wing parties in Latin America, Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela, Xi Jinping of China, and Hassan Rouhani of Iran as the socialist enemies of Brazil. John Bolton, he tweeted after Bolsonaro visited Donald Trump that he was proud to make Brazil a major non-NATO ally and looking forward to working with them on Venezuela, Iran, and China. So we see that there is a convergence here. And at the United Nations a couple of weeks ago, Bolsonaro made a speech saying that he was not there to raise nationalities and sovereignties in the name of an abstract global interest. And he said, this is not the global interest organization, it is the United Nations organization, and so it must remain. Now, as for the implications of this new Brazilian identity, so the construction and imposition of this new identity involves three sets of risks. The first one is the risk to Brazil's global standing. Brazil might isolate itself from the world if it does away with traditional diplomatic values such as multilateralism, economic pragmatism, and etc. These are things that have characterized Brazil's foreign policy ever since the early 1900s. So this is something that Brazil is apparently doing away with. A second risk is risk to Brazil's trade capacities. Brazil's new foreign policy has consistently alienated traditional trade partners such as China, South America, and Argentina, and Arab and Muslim countries because of Bolsonaro's promises to all the groups around him. And finally, there is a risk to democracy because combating globalism and socialism often involves the elimination of the other. That means to say socialists, activists, professors, teachers, liberals, or anyone who opposes Bolsonaro's ideology. And this might lead finally to the partial or total collapse of Bolsonaro's political support and his governing capacity for the next 3 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'm going to invite our panelists up to the stage, and I'm told that we should be using microphones for recording purposes. So I invite you to ask your questions.
Yeah, I'll come around with the microphone. We have about 10, 12 minutes for Q&A, so just a few brief questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I had a question for the last speaker, Guilherme. Where is environment in this new policy of Bolsonaro? Because with anti-globalism raising its head in Brazil, perhaps there wouldn't be a need to export all these soybeans, and there'll be more of an impetus to protect the environment.
Should we do a round?
Yeah, let's go ahead and collect a couple of questions because we don't have a lot of time. Over there on the right.
Yeah, so I'm Melvin Levitsky, and I was ambassador to Brazil from 1994 to 1998 and served during the military regime before that. So I found this very interesting. Thank you for those of you who came and for our, I guess, postdoc as well. I think, you know, we were talking about Bolsonaro. My sense of this was a kind of disgust among the Brazilian population, with corruption being the most driving factor. And Sergio Moro was a great hero of this enterprise, exposing it. And part of this is, and it's kind of interesting that I think the electorate that elected Bolsonaro also was the same electorate that elected Lula. So why is this? Lula and the PT always had a kind of reputation of being an honest party. It showed the mensalão, where they paid monthly payments to some of the politicians to vote for bills, and then the car wash, the Lava Jato and everything, sort of exposed that. So it's kind of interesting, and I think this idea of corruption, that particularly among the lower classes, seeing the political elite as taking advantage of them, is what really led most of them to vote for Bolsonaro. I don't think the idea of bringing the military dictatorship back was very appealing, and I think corruption was really at the heart of this, and the fact that the political class and the system itself, where you have changing ministers every few months because they make political deals, is really what kind of drove this to the population to vote for Bolsonaro. And we'll see how this comes out. The Congress seems to be putting some strictures in Bolsonaro's rule. So it's just a comment rather than a question, but just a sort of different kind of view of why Bolsonaro became popular. Thanks.
Do we have one more question? Okay. Let's go over on this side.
Thank you for the panel. This was really interesting. I have a question that is coming from someone who really doesn't know much about Brazil, but I feel like I need this information for understanding of this context. So does Bolsonaro have a stable electoral base? And if yes, then who are those people? And if no, then who is voting for him?
I think those three speak to each other well, so let's go ahead and throw it to the panel. And if you keep your responses relatively brief, we'll have time for one more quick round. So who'd like to?
Shall I begin?
Sure, yes.
Okay, so the environment plays a very important role in Bolsonaro's narrative, especially because of sovereignty. So he's been talking a lot about sovereignty, and he uses the Amazon as the great example of Brazil's struggle to protect itself from globalists everywhere. Our foreign minister, Araújo, he's a climate change denier. So he uses the idea of fighting globalism to say most of what scientists say is wrong about climate change. So we want to preserve the Amazon, but on the other hand, we have to be very careful as to the so-called scientific consensus on climate change, because the Amazon has nothing to do with climate change. At least that's how they try to put it. But what we see is that there's a clash between different sectors within the government. So we have, on the one hand, climate change deniers, anti-globalists, mostly ideological at heart, and we have the big landowners, the big agrarian producers, commodity producers, who, they benefit from some destruction of the Amazon rainforest, but at the same time they want to keep it as sustainable as possible, especially because they export a lot to countries that have green seals or green barriers to to exports. So European countries, for example, they care a lot about the environment, so we cannot export soy or beef to countries if we are not sustainable, at least minimally sustainable. So we see a clash between these two groups. Landowners on the one hand and anti-globalists on the other hand, they've been fighting each other to see what kind of strategy will prevail. So far, because Olavo de Carvalho has been so influential in appointing people for the foreign policy cabinet, so the anti-globalist group has so far won the struggle. And this is the reason why some landowners and big producers are going crazy now, because Brazil has alienated countries like China or some Islamic countries who buy a lot of meat and soybeans from Brazil. And we don't know what's going to happen in the next 3 years, but I think that this fight will continue up until the moment one of the groups just walks away from the government. From what I perceive, I think that the ideologues of the government tend to prevail because they are very influential and they are very close to the president because two of his sons are part of this ideological scheme.
Either of the other panelists have responses to the questions about base of support and corruption?
I just had a quick couple of points. The first is actually a response to Guilherme's presentation, which is just a small point, which is another, to me, a huge risk that we haven't talked about yet of Bolsonaro's government is what I see as his attack on the federal university system in Brazil, his attack on higher education, which he sees as infiltrated by communism and basically in need of flushing out. And, we'll see how that all plays out, but it's hardcore. So while I was in Ceará, Bolsonaro handpicked the provost of the university, not for somebody who hadn't been indicated by the faculty, staff, and students, his sort of own handpicked puppet. And it's really trying to create chaos within the federal university system. And it's kind of a vision of, you don't need humanities, you don't need social sciences, you just need technical education. It's actually something I think borrowed from like Salazar in Portugal in the 40s and 50s. But anyway, about corruption, I agree, but I also think you have to be careful. As my understanding, I'm interested to hear what Marília would say about this. In the 60s, in the 64 coup, there was also a lot of talk about anti-corruption. It wasn't all anti-communism. It was, we need to clean out this government. And so anti-corruption serves as kind of a smokescreen for lots of things, as we know from this country. And so I don't think you would necessarily say that, Trump got elected because Americans were fed up with corruption and they believed in his drain the swamp. Maybe they did, I don't know. He talked about anti-corruption. He campaigned on drain the swamp. Is that what Trumpism is really about? So I think you don't want to go too far in saying that Bolsonarism is actually purely anti-corruption. I don't deny that it was a powerful force in the election, but to me it's a very slippery concept, and it's not always clear what's really behind this kind of anti-corruption crusade. Bolsonaro very quickly turned on a dime and is now sort of, whoa, let's not investigate. There's this lava toga thing, and he's like, no, we don't want to do that. We don't want to investigate. So, like Trump, actually turns out to not be an anti-corruption hero.
His own son, he just stopped the investigations about his own son corruption charges. And I just have one thing about to say about the corruption. Again, my area's history. I'm just observing what has been happening with Bolsonaro, and it reminds me a lot of my own research of what I see when studying the dictatorship. And with the corruption specifically, it has a face, right? The corruption Bolsonaro talks about is it's not the corruption of PSDB, for example, the right-wing party, or PMDB, or MDB now. They changed the name again. But it's the PT, it's the Workers' Party, and they are corrupt communists. So again, this idea of communism and the communists and the enemy that kind of needs to be eliminated, but it has a face. It's Lula, how like Guilherme said, it's Lula. Lula is the communist who is corrupt.
Okay, we have time for just one or two more questions. I saw one here, if you still have.
I'm a historian too, but my question is very presentist. No, I've just seen that his poll figures have been dipping in the last several months, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how we explain that. What may have been. How do you interpret those last several months of kind of dropping poll figures? Because I don't have an explanation myself, so I was curious if you have one.
I also saw a question over here somewhere. Yeah.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask, since there's so much of Bolsonaro's ideology that's based around both Olavo de Carvalho and evangelical Christianity in general, do you think that Catholicism or sort of like Catholic identity or the church itself or its hierarchy could be any sort of locus of opposition or resistance at all to him, or is that something that's not likely to happen?
Any final question? Okay. So let's go ahead and close with this round of questions, if anyone would like to.
Okay. Brazil is just a mildly Catholic country. 70% of Brazilians identify themselves as Catholic, but we are a country of syncretism. Not sure if that's the expression, but there's a lot of external influence to our Catholic faith. So I'd say that our Catholic identity, it's very deep-rooted in the history of the country, but at the same time, we don't see the Catholic religion as one of the drivers of Brazil's identity. I'd say that our identity ever since the 1930s has been built upon secular grounds. But now with the rise of evangelical Christians, especially neo-Pentecostal Christians, this has changed for the 30% of Brazil who identifies themselves as evangelicals. But I don't see Catholics as an organized force to resist Bolsonaro's attacks or to support Bolsonaro. Evangelicals, they do. I mean, 75% of evangelicals voted for Bolsonaro last year. At the same time, Catholics are a little bit more scattered across the country. We see no signs of resistance, such as the ecclesial communities in the 1980s, for example, who were a very important force in transitioning to democracy. We don't see this happening anymore. Brazil Never Again was part of this. But at the same time, I see Carvalho as a fundamentalist Catholic on his own. And this is very curious because he calls, do you speak Portuguese? He calls evangélicos evangegues. Evangelicals are called by Olavo de Carvalho as even donkeys or something like that, very derogatory. So we see a clash of religious views within the government too. But I'd say that there is a conservative common ground that suits pretty much everybody. So whenever Bolsonaro talks about God or talks about the Gospel of John or talks about the truth, I'd say that it resonates among Catholics too, but not as much as evangelicals. Now, just to wrap it up, I'd say that Bolsonaro's government is grounded on 5 different social groups. In Portuguese, I call them the 5 Bs, which would stand for Bols, or the rural producers, Bible, banks, the free market liberals, Bullet, which is the Bancada da Bala and all the anti-corruption and pro-police supporters. And finally, Bolsolavismo, which is this ideological phenomenon that basically gives the main ideological driving force for Bolsonaro. Now, the problem about Bolsonaro, and that's probably why his approval ratings are going down, is that out of these 5 groups, I'd say the Bolsonaro only governs consistently to the ideological group that corresponds to roughly 12% of Brazil's population. So even though he was elected by 57 million people, and even though his approval ratings are at 28, 29%, he only actually governs to 15 or 12. And that has served well during the campaign. But it's not going to work for 4 years, especially in such a tight presidential system that we have. So he might be impeached at some point if he keeps governing just to a tiny little minority, especially because he's also alienated Congress in the process.
Yeah, I had a couple things. On the Catholic question, I saw some work by a researcher at Unicamp, and his findings were that nationwide Catholics, so evangelicals voted overwhelmingly for Bolsonaro. The only actual religious group that voted even more overwhelmingly than evangelicals for Bolsonaro was actually Jews. Kind of sad, but he's a very pro-Israel guy. but Catholics basically broke even. And so I think that's, sort of in keeping with what Guilherme said. Catholics, they aren't Bolsonaristas, but they're also not going to be a powerful force against Bolsonarismo. And the reality of Brazil also, I'm cribbing off of this scholar at Unicamp, apparently by 2030 is going to be a majority evangelical country. So if you really, so the line I've been giving is like, if you don't like the way evangelical politics is playing out in Brazil, then you either need to turn the tide against evangelicalism, which I don't think is going to happen, or you need to find, progressive forces need to find partnerships with evangelical leaders. It seems to me the only path forward. Now the question of the base and his popularity, I heard it interesting. He had a kind of an uptick in his popularity recently because he was hospitalized and he wasn't able to actually give any interviews. And so it sort of seems like when he doesn't talk, gets more popular. And I think this speaks also to what Guilherme said. A lot of the people who voted for Bolsonaro were making an anti-PT vote. And they don't necessarily like Bolsonaro, the guy. They don't like him as their representative. We were just talking about this, Rio and Sao Paulo and Belo Horizonte, over places that in the U.S. would be absolutely blue, right? They're big cities, cosmopolitan places. They voted overwhelmingly for Bolsonaro. But a lot of those people aren't really down with this kind of, crazy left wing or crazy right, whatever it is, Bolsonarismo. They just didn't want the PT in power anymore. And so those are the people who now, when you take those polls, they're not happy with his performance as president, and I think that explains a lot of the fluctuation.
Just one last thing that I was thinking about while you were talking, and he was also elected promising change, right? So if change doesn't come, what happens? I think that's part of losing popularity as well.
Yeah, he hasn't just alienated Congress. He's been unable to. I mean, there's been some movement on some things, but Paulo Guedes, his economic advisor, hasn't been able to get his proposals through. A lot of things have gotten blocked in Congress, and so he's not governed particularly well.
Okay, and we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much to the panel. Please join me in welcoming. Thank you, ma'am.